Hello and welcome to today's expert chat at Understood. My name is Julie Raw and I'm an Understood editor. And our topic today is respecting a child's processing speed in a fast-paced world. And I'm very pleased to welcome our expert today, which is Ellen Braaten. She's the director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's also the associate director of the Clay Center for Young and Healthy Minds and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. Hello, Ellen. How are you doing today?
Great.
We are very happy to have you here. You have been doing some terrific pieces for Understood about processing speed. And I just want to kick things off today. Before we dive in, I just want to say for all the folks watching this online, you can please submit your questions in the chat box. If you want to introduce yourself, say your name, where you're from, that's terrific. Or if you just want to submit your questions anonymously, that's A-OK. And so we'll dive right in. Ellen, I know that processing speed is of interest to you, not just professionally, but also personally. I was wondering if you could talk with us about your family's connection to processing speed.
Sure. It is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. First of all, because I have seen over the years just so many children struggle with this issue. And I have seen how devastating it can be if it goes untreated or undiagnosed or unrecognized. But I also have a son who's 21 who has the same sort of similar profile. So I know what it's like to live with a child who has incredible potential, but needs extra time to be able to show the world what he knows and what he's capable of doing. And so I have experienced firsthand the frustrations that can come and also the joys that can come too. And it's a whole lot easier when I'm assessing a child and telling parents what to do rather than actually having to follow my own advice. So yes, this is...
And one other thing for the folks watching this chat, Ellen has also written a terrific book about processing speed called Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. And I think one of the things that is so perplexing to many parents is, how can you have a smart child who, takes so long to process information?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, you just recently did a terrific piece for us, an infographic explaining some of the different things that might be going on in kids' brains that on an anatomical level might explain this. So I don't know if you want to start there or...
Sure. Well, why don't I just answer the first part of that question in terms of how someone can be smart and still have slow processing speed, is that they're really two different things. And yes, if you kind of did a Venn diagram, there's a middle piece to that too. But really, being able to think really deeply about something does not necessarily mean that you need to do it quickly. And being able to complete something quickly doesn't mean you're thinking about it very deeply. And that's one way to sort of think about how it is. Now, in our culture, we oftentimes equate speed with smartness. And that's sort of a value judgment. It's not an actual assessment of what somebody's really capable of doing and how creative they are and how well they can think through a problem. It just really gives us an indication of how fast they are. Things like copying or minute math or those sorts of things. And those are important skills in our educational environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't give us an indication of how bright someone is. In terms of the infographic, do you want me to just jump right into that?
Sure. It's one of my favorite pieces we've done recently.
It's a very cool graphic. And so one of the things that, because when you're with a child who's processing things slowly, it feels like they're not doing it fast enough on purpose. And so the infographic really gives us an insight into what could be going on in the brain of a child with slower processing speed. So a lot of it talks about neurons. And I think neurons we just need to remember, just a fancy word for a brain cell, but it's a kind of a special kind of brain cell. Neurons are cells, because our bodies are composed of all different sorts of cells that have different kinds of responsibilities. And a neuron is a brain cell that its responsibility is to communicate with each other. So it's to relay information. So it's a very special kind of cell that's in our nervous system. And so one of the things that we wonder about is that there are all these nerve cells, these neurons, and they have to communicate with each other. And they communicate with each other, but they're not touching one another. In some kids, and I don't know if you, the space between the neurons themselves may be a little bit wider than in other kids. Now, none of these things that I'm going to talk about, there's no way of testing this. There's no way of looking into a child's brain and saying, oh, this is where their issue is. But we do know from lots of different sorts of research done on brain and brain functioning that these are things that can impact how quickly a brain can do something. So one of them is that space between the neurons, that it could be, it just has further for the, yeah, go ahead.
Let me just pause for 1 second. You're saying how these neurons have to communicate with each other, and I just wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper, which is they communicate by sending, is it an electrical signal that jumps from one neuron to the next? Is that
exactly? Exactly, that's right. So that's exactly right. They're electrical impulses that jump from one signal to the next. And some kids, well, like I said, with slower processing speed have a further space between those, so it's longer. There's longer for those electrical impulses to travel. So some researchers think that more space between those neurons just slows down the messages that are being relayed in the brain. Another issue that could also impact brain, how quickly the brain processes information, is something called the myelin coating. And this some parts of the neuron, and I don't know if were you going to put the graphic up to show this, or?
Yeah, it's actually, I think our viewers can see it.
Oh, good, great, perfect. So you can see that there are different parts of the neuron, that there's a sort of a central body, and then there are these dendrites, these little areas, and then there's something called an axon. And the axons are coated in something called myelin, and it's really just the simplest thing to think about is the coating. Very much like in electricity, when something is coated well, the electrical impulse goes better, it's quicker. So in some children, we think that maybe the myelin coating is thinner, meaning that the electrical impulses along that area of the cell are not moving as quickly. In some kids, maybe it's just later to develop. So there are certain kids that I have seen over the years who show very slow processing speed when they're younger, and it gets better over time. And it makes me think that perhaps in certain kids' brains that the myelin is just that sort of generation of the myelin is just slower in certain kids. So that's one. That's another area.
Because the myelin, it gets thicker as babies get older. It gets thicker, and then late in life it gets a bit thinner too, right? There's sort of a natural arc to it.
Yes, and yes, it does. So, and it doesn't really stop generating until somewhere in our mid-20s. So for some students, it can really, their brain isn't fully developed no one's brain is really fully developed until we're in our 20s. Yes, and then as our brain develops, it's not very soon after that it starts to, break down a little bit.
Let me pause just for 1 second about the myelin, which is, this is still something that is just a research. Researchers are exploring this. This is not something where you go to your local pediatrician and say, I want to get my kid's myelin checked.
No, and nor is there much we could do, even if we could do that right now. We wouldn't know how to treat that. But yes, there isn't any value in doing that, nor is there a test that would really be indicating as to what to do about that. And we don't even know, for example, brains, individual brains are different anyway. So if we looked at someone's brain, one child with slower processing speed may look very similar as another. So, there are individual differences in myelin coating too.
Great. Let me just pause you for 1 second. We're getting some great questions from viewers. I just want to say we're going to go through the rest of the infographic. It's just a couple more steps.
Okay, I'll be fast.
So after we go through some of the reasons why a child might be having issues with processing speed, then we're going to talk about strategies, what parents can do to help. So I just wanted to thank everyone for their questions so far and keep them coming. We just want to go through the other two steps on this infographic.
And I'll be very quick. So we already talked about the space between the neurons. Another reason why a child might be slower at processing is that neurotransmitters are chemicals that help the brain cells communicate with one another. We think in certain students or certain children that the neurotransmitters are either lacking or they're not in the right, there's not enough of them. There may be low levels of certain kinds of neurotransmitters. We have some ideas about the kinds of neurotransmitters that are helpful in processing speed. We don't necessarily, again, it's not one of those things that we can diagnose or look at or give a child some kind of medication that would help speed up processing speed in terms of neurotransmitters. And then just in one last way that processing speed may be slowed down is just when we look at the whole brain, and particularly the frontal lobes of the brain, the part of our brain that's really responsible for helping us stay organized and do things quickly and be able to triage what do we do when, that part of the brain may be underdeveloped in some students, or it just takes them a longer time to develop what we call pathways. So the more we do something, the more our brain is able to develop a pathway, whether it's learning a new language or learning how to ride a bike, that as we're practicing those skills, our brain is actually developing connections that allow us to learn those skills and to do them fluently. For some kids, it may take longer to develop those pathways for various reasons. So those are kind of the main reasons that processing speed may be slowed down.
Great. Well, actually, that flows nicely into the how can we help part of all this. This is a big overarching question. We have a viewer who ask if you could talk just a little bit more about the theme of today's talk is about respecting a child's processing speed. And this viewer asked if you could talk a bit more about what you mean by respect. Does that mean showing compassion? Does that mean in an education setting? How could a teacher respect a child's processing speed? Does that mean saying, I'm sorry you can't keep up? Or is there more ways that a teacher can show respect?
I think one way to just show respect is to find out what the problem is. So I think knowing that there is a problem and what a child is capable of or not capable of, I think is the first way to show respect, is to get information, because that will inform the way that you treat the child. And I think that in terms of showing respect, I think of it as valuing differences in learning styles. So not everyone can be the fastest at anything. It's just everything is in a bell-shaped curve. So valuing the fact that students who have a slower pace actually bring something to the table that might be very different. And I think probably this listener has had the experience where you're with a child who you think is not paying attention at all or hasn't been part of the discussion, and then all of a sudden comes up with the most amazing insight because they've been chewing on something or thinking about something in a very different way. They're not generally the child with their hand up, immediately as soon as the teacher asks a question. And so I think valuing really means really realizing that they bring something different. And I don't know if I've said this on one of the previous webcasts, but we spend so much time in our culture trying to figure out how to slow down. We all go to the yoga classes and the meditation classes and all of that. These kids know this already. Like, they have a really good sense of what it means to sort of sit back and kind of watch. So a lot of us who are fast-paced really wish we had a little bit of that in ourselves. And, I talked about my son, and probably can tell that I'm not a slow processor. So we have a very different sort of way of relating to the world, but we have so much to teach one another. And he has so much to teach me about, Mom, just slow down and let's just talk, or like making dinner, just taking time to do something like making dinner instead of making dinner just to get on to the next thing that we're on to. So valuing really means, respecting and realizing there's something we have to learn from them.
Yeah, and I think to this viewer's question, I think a teacher can show compassion.
Yes.
In an informal way. There are these accommodations you can do informally, something like, when you ask a question of the class, don't call on this child first. Let this child go second or third. Give the child some time to process it. And then there's also a piece that I believe we just shared in the chat box It's classroom accommodations for
Yes.
kids with processing speed issues, and that includes, if there's several of these could be done informally, or if a child has an IEP or 504, things like minimizing the amount of copying a child has to do from the board, or could you give a child a copy of your notes as a teacher, something to sort of cut down on the rote work and let the child focus on the thinking part of the assignments. So that's a great piece for parents to check out. And we've been getting several questions about, on a practical level, what can I do? What kind of classroom accommodations could help? Are there any classroom accommodations that you know and love, Ellen?
Well, I think you hit on one of my favorites, and that is just to decrease the amount of stuff that a child has to do, whether it's the amount of things that they have to keep track of, or amount of stuff that has to be copied from the board. I mean, the simplest thing is to just provide more time, and but note taking is a big one. Even like I was saying, having to keep track of too many things, too many papers, because all of that takes time to sort of make sure you know where everything is. And then I also just valuing individual differences, that every child brings something different. And for some reason, processing speed isn't one of those things that we tend to say, oh, well, like for instance, for a child who has trouble reading, we can say, well, everybody learns to read differently. But we have trouble sort of saying that about processing speed, that everybody is just works at their own pace. Somehow there always seems to be a little bit of a pushback with that. And again, I've even experienced it myself. So,
one question that came through yesterday in the Understood community section was about whether a child with slow processing speed can take advanced classes or AP classes.
Great question. And my first answer is, of course they can. I just think it has to be thoughtful. And so my recommendation often is for there to be some discussion about what areas do they love. And that's the area to push yourself in. And again, here's a lesson for life. If you don't have slower processing speed, it's still a good idea to sort of think, where do I want to spend my time? Because I see plenty of kids who take all AP classes, and sometimes it's like they're missing out on some of the good stuff in life too. So I think definitely yes, but if you know your child that math is a bit of a more of a struggle, you don't want to do the AP math. If their love is history or written language, you want to spend your time doing that and sort of keeping a balance. So yes, they can do it. It just has to be very thoughtful.
We just got a question about the use of technology to help with processing speed. Do you think that using maybe dictation software or other things other than pencil and paper, do you see those as helping with processing speed?
Yes, I do. I think it's a double-edged sword in some areas. So definitely things like, and it really depends on the child. This is one of those things where you just have to do some things by trial and error and see what works. So dictation can be very good for the child who has trouble writing and taking notes. It can sometimes be difficult for the child who has trouble sort of organizing their thoughts. They may need to do a combination of that. Also, technology can be tough when, for instance, when teachers started to put all of the homework assignments on the internet, I thought this is going to be great because the kids don't have to copy that all down from the board. Sometimes in some school districts, though, in high schools, each teacher has his or her own website. So you've got a child with slower processing speed that now has to wade through 6 or 7 websites to get the assignments. That's going to slow them down. That's all kind of that quick sort of processing that can be tough. So technology really, it depends. And again, it's one of those things that has to be used thoughtfully.
Yes, absolutely. We got a question on Facebook about that infographic we were just going over, asking based on the section about neurotransmitters, saying, okay, well, great, so what next? What neurotransmitters can I give my child? I think there's a question a lot of people have, which is, will ADHD medication, will those stimulants help kids with processing speed issues?
So we don't have evidence that that's the case. And again, you might even hear some people say, gee, I feel like my child's a little bit quicker because he's on attention medication. But for the most part, the answer would be no, we don't have that technology yet. I do think this is going to be a very a field that's going to, once drug companies start to think about this in a different way, I'm positive that they will start to look at, in fact, I know they are already doing that, looking at medications that might help that particular area of processing speed. But there's a lot that we still need to do. And the medications for ADHD can be helpful just in general. If you're attending better, your just life is going to be smoother. And so one of the things I recommend for kids with slower processing speed is to think about being efficient. So it's not necessarily being faster, because sometimes you just can't make someone faster, but you can make them more efficient. So medication for ADHD may make a child more apt to be more efficient, which kind of doesn't really speed them up per se, but it speeds up the whole way that they can interact with the environment. So the answer to the question is no, there really aren't medications or anything that we can give a child to sort of help their neurotransmission now. But I really am pretty confident that some point in the future, or not next year, but at some point in the future, people will be thinking of that and able to do something with that.
So for now, it's streamlining, trying to make the process as efficient as possible, a child's process, and practice.
Yes, and also, a lot of children with slow processing speed have comorbid or co-occurring issues in other areas, and it really means treating those areas. The most common are learning disabilities such as dyslexia, definitely ADHD, but also things like depression and anxiety. So you want to make sure you're treating those other issues well, because we don't want to forget about those, and that also is just going to help in general.
That's actually a great segue to a question we got from Travis Harker, who says, my daughter is 10 years old and was identified with dyslexia about 2 years ago and has slow processing speed as well. She often gets frustrated with tasks when they don't come easily for her. And he says, what can I do to support my child when she gets frustrated and wants to give up? In other words, how can I support her resilience?
Well, we do know what we know about resilience is that feeling a sense of self-efficacy is very important. So in order to feel good about ourselves, we need to first have a good knowledge of who we are. So that's another thing about resiliency. When we look at a student's age into college, the students with learning disabilities who are in college actually show more resiliency than kids without learning disabilities in college. So it's almost to the point where you think, well, it would be great if my child had a learning disability. The problem is not enough of students with learning disabilities get into college. So the key is to make sure your daughter knows about who she is, and again, values that part of her, that this is her profile, this is who she is, and as much as you can, just as matter of fact as you can be about it, as well as being informative is important. And then also trying as hard as you can to work with her to figure out what's going to help her. So, for example, talking to her about, okay, where's the frustration today? What would be helpful? How can I be helpful? How can we think through this? I think that gives her a sense of self-efficacy that, oh, this is a problem, and there may be a solution to it, and I may have input into that. That helps build that, and that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in fourth grade or fifth grade. What you're thinking about is, the long road to college and to life, but that's sort of a way of building that.
Yeah, and I would add to that for Travis and for some other folks who have been asking us about resilience. Understood has a lot of great content about self-advocacy, which is, as Ellen just mentioned, a key part of helping kids stay resilient. And Understood has pieces about tips for grade schoolers building self-advocacy, and we also have some great tips on how to help with reducing frustration. So those are some good things for folks to check out. We just got a question from a parent saying, my child is in a fast-paced school. Do you think it's worth thinking about a school with a slower pace? What do you think about Montessori and or Waldorf schools for kids with slow processing speeds?
Well, I do think that one of the issues in terms of solving the problem of processing speed is having a good match to the child and the environment. So giving some thought to a slower paced school if it's possible. It's not always possible, but I think that's a very valid question, and I think it can actually go a long way in treating some of these issues. If you're in an environment that matches your pace, you're going to be happier, more productive, feel more a sense of self-efficacy. I'm actually a big fan of both Waldorf and Montessori because they are so self-paced. The downside about Montessori sometimes is that some kids who have slow processing speed and ADHD may not have the organizational skills to stay on task. That doesn't mean they can't do it, but it's a wonderful approach to learning. And Waldorf is the same way. Waldorf is very child-centered. It's very much experiential. So I think both of those are very good options for parents who want to slow them down. To slow down the learning environment without slowing down the actual content. I think those are both good options, but it does vary on the particular child too.
And circling back to our earlier conversation about classroom accommodations, maybe trying those first.
Yes.
As you're exploring other options. We also got a very technical question about if slow processing speed is not an official learning disability, can a child with slow processing speed still get an IEP?
Very good question. So what I try to do is to find where the slow processing speed may be tripping them up academically, because in order to get an IEP, you need the question implies, you need a label. So if they meet criteria for ADHD, that can gain them the label for an IEP. Also, for some kids who don't have ADHD, oftentimes they have problems with academic fluency, either math fluency or reading fluency or writing fluency. Let me
pause it. When you say fluency in that sense of academic fluency, can you help us understand?
So for example, math fluency is how quickly you can do a page of multiplication problems, or how quickly you can do a page of simple arithmetic problems. The child may have great math skills, may not meet criteria for a math disability, dyscalculia, as we might term it, but they cannot fluently do math. For a child with a reading problem, they may just read very slowly, even outside of dyslexia, or they may be very slow at writing a piece of, an essay or sentences. So those are actually criteria that will get you a label in our new diagnostic manual, that you don't have to have the full-blown criteria to get a learning disability in reading. It can be a learning disability in reading due to problems with just reading fluency. So that's where I look, is there something that we can identify academically that will gain them the entry into an IEP.
We have another question about how to help kids with processing speed, which is activating prior knowledge one of the keys to increasing processing speed?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, yes. I mean, we all, when we can, it's sort of like our brain is a file cabinet in a way, and when things are filed well, or so that we can access them easily, yes, we can get to it more quickly. So I'm not sure if that's the question they were asking, but yes, if we can make connections with today's learning to last week's or last year's learning, that's always going to help us get that information more quickly when we're looking for it, when we're searching for it.
Great. And I think we just have time for one more question, which is, I'm trying to find it here. Thank you all for all the great questions. It's about when teachers don't seem to quite, I know there's several teachers watching today, but teachers who are not yet familiar with processing speed issues. There's a parent who's wondering, how do I deal with a teacher who equates slow processing speed with stupidity or laziness?
And like I said at the beginning, it's easy when you're working with a child who has slow processing speed to think that. The best way to convince a teacher or anyone is to get data. And so a good evaluation that pinpoints where a child's weakness is really hard to argue with. I would also say things like the infographic that you showed that really shows that there's a biological basis to this. So really getting information about your child and seeing where the problems are are and seeing that in black and white, along with providing the teacher with information about really what's going on for a child, I think can be very powerful.
Well, that is terrific. Thank you, Ellen, so much for your time today.
Welcome.
And thank you to all the viewers for your great questions. This was terrific. We are going to be archiving this chat, so if anyone wants to watch it later, it'll be up in the next day or so. And if you want to check out our upcoming schedule of chats with experts, you can go to u.org/calendar. And we just appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a great day.